From where I sit, the Russian-Ukraine war is one that could have been avoided. Unfortunately, it commenced in the manner that it did. And one must understand the history of this war. It must be understood in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reemergence of the Russian Federation as we know it. And of course, we know what then happened with the former component states of the Soviet Union, with the Ukraine herself going through a referendum and becoming a republic, and the Russian Federation becoming what it is now. And the assurances in the 1990s by NATO that they would not allow former countries in the former Soviet Union, which are geographically contiguous to the Russian Federation, to become members of NATO. It is in this context that for a long time, Ukraine was seen as a country that would remain neutral in the sense that it would not join NATO. The same was true of the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The same was also true with Finland, and many of those who understand history will always understand, depending on where you sit, the doctrine of Finlandization. And this was meant to give Russia the comfort that there would be no military threat to you. And successive American heads of states and successive leaders in Ukraine post the collapse of the Soviet Union have behaved in a manner that was consistent with that agreement in order to ensure peace. Comes Zelensky, then he takes a totally different path. And he takes the path of saying that we are no longer going to be, in his words, a satellite state of Russia. And come an administration in the United States of America under Joe Biden, which thinks that we've got to reclaim our territory and expand, effectively reneging on the agreement that was entered into with Russia, complete with an application or an indication by the Ukrainian government that we want to join NATO, we want to join the EU, and we want our agreement with NATO, our application with NATO to be fast-tracked. And when you do that under the NATO treaty in 1949, you attack any NATO country, then you'll be an enemy of all the NATO countries. And Russia is alarmed. And Russia then chooses to engage in what they call a special operation to neutralize this. And that is, in brief, what brought us where we are. And 2 years down the line, this conflict is alive and well, largely because the United States of America have been urging the administration of Zelensky to continue. The European Union has been urging him to continue, so that effectively what started as a special operation has now become a full-fledged proxy war that is being conducted by Western Europe against Russia. That is effectively what is happening. In my view, had Ukraine been left on its own, this war would have ended within 6 months. But it cannot end now. They have waded so deep into blood that to go back is as tedious as to go forward, to use that famous line from William Shakespeare. In my view, they have nothing to gain other than to believe and to continue to believe that they are the greatest power on earth. They are hegemon. And I believe that the more they keep Russia occupied in that war and they use it as a theater of testing their new weapons, that is perhaps the best that they gain. And what they do is their military industry also gains. In fact, there are commentators that have said, including the Secretary of State of the United States of America, that whatever donations or whatever support we give to Ukraine, most of it remains in the United States of America because we use it to buy arms for them. So if you ask yourself, In truth, it is the kind of war that the United States of America does not need. It does not need it because it doesn't give any benefits to them. But remember that when you are a military hegemon in the manner that the United States of America is, and you see a rising power in the form of Russia, then this is designed to checkmate Russia, to keep Russia busy, and to ensure, in their view, that Russia does not make forays into their spheres of influence in Latin America or their emerging influence in Africa and even in Asia. That perhaps is the value from where I sit. Other commentators and other analysts may think otherwise. In my view, and many have said it, and I have said this, if there was a different administration in the United States of America, perhaps this war would have ended. Because what would have happened is that Russia would have been given assurance, number one, that Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO. Number two, that Ukraine is not going to join EU, that Ukraine is going to be neutral, and there is nothing wrong with neutrality. Switzerland has demonstrated to us that you can be neutral and survive. You are available, and Ukraine, in my view, in its best interest, should be neutral. Because look at this, this is a country that supplies the world with grain and fertilizer. You can do that to Europe, you can do that to Africa, you can do that to other parts of the world without being politically allied or aligned in any way. But to choose to create an enemy with people who are fundamentally your kith and kin is, in my view, completely misadvised, because it is your sons and daughters and your institutions and your installations that are suffering. If you look at the population of places like such as Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, and Donbass, you'll find that they are people of Russian origin and people of Ukrainian origin. These are brothers and sisters. Why should you be made to fight and to create enmity for life by people who are several thousands of miles removed from you? This is the kind of reflection that one would have wanted to see happening in the administration in Kiev. And many have tried to persuade the Kiev administration to think in this direction. This thinking has come from President Erdogan in Turkey. This thinking has come from individuals in Belarus. And this thinking has come from President Putin in Moscow. But the handlers of President Zelensky, from where I sit, are telling him from Bonn, from Brussels, from London, and from Washington, continue with the war. And in fact, when you listen to some of the rhetoric in the unguarded moments of people from the West, they say, we will not stop until we win this war. It's as if they are the ones fighting Russia in the unguarded moments. To what end? And history has been consistent. People have been made to fight proxy wars, and they, at the end, are the ones who suffer. Because when it comes to rebuilding, I think this is what Western Europe is now saying. When it comes to rebuilding Ukraine, it is our companies that are going to rebuild Ukraine. We are the ones that are going to supply arms to Ukraine. So there is also an economic angle to all these, which the Ukrainian administration is incapable of seeing at this stage because they are so preoccupied, they are so consumed with anger, they are so consumed with this misguided belief that membership in NATO or membership in the European Union is going to be the magic wand that will save Ukraine from the Russians. I think there is a sense in which the population in the United States of America and even politicians from across the political divide are getting tired. They are saying, we have our own domestic problems in the United States of America. Why are we funding this war? what is the value of this war? And I've heard some commentators saying that America has been involved in these kinds of wars over the years. We were involved in Vietnam. We lost our men and women. We suffered economically and diplomatically. We were involved in Afghanistan. We suffered politically and diplomatically. We were involved in Iraq. We suffered diplomatically and politically. We cannot get out of Syria. And with the coming of the war in Gaza by Israel, the appetite for the war in Ukraine is not there. And in fact, remembering that America is going into elections later in the year 2024, there are those who are inclining towards a Republican candidate in the hope that when a Republican candidate is elected and the candidate they are naming is Donald Trump, then these wars will end. That tells you that the appetite for this is disappearing, and that is why people in the United States Congress and in the political class are saying, let us not use this money in this manner. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help anybody. It is only destroying our relationship with a country that you cannot ignore. You cannot ignore Russia. You cannot, even if you wanted. And in fact, what has emerged is that when people thought that through sanctions you could destroy Russia, it has emerged that they have become politically very nimble and agile, and their economy is even projected to grow under a regime of sanctions. So that is the attitude that one sees emerging in the United States of America, loss of appetite for throwing good money after bad. If you look at the history not only of Russia and many countries, when you are in the stage in which you are, it is not the best time to change the ship's captain. I have no doubt in my mind that barring disaster, Vladimir Putin will be elected as the president of Russia. The US is a very tricky environment. You cannot, even if I look at my political crystal ball, it is not easy to predict. But if you look at what is happening now, if the two wars continue, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, and they continue in the trajectory in which they are, and there is no court order barring Donald Trump, who is likely to be the Republican presidential candidate, it is not going to be easy for Joe Biden. So I wouldn't myself, without attempting to predict, I wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump is the president of the United States of America come January the year 2025. You know, Donald Trump has a very different approach to how to run the United States of America. He says America first. Remember when he was a president during his first term, he was saying, we have funded NATO for too long. We have funded Europe for too long. The time is now for us to look inside of the United States of America and deal with the things that are in the best interest of the United States of America. In other words, funding would dry up for Zelensky and the Ukrainians. In other words, funding would dry up for Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis. Funding would dry up for many of these multinational organizations which are funded largely by America. And when funding dries up, activity slows down. So I think that if there is an administration of the Republicans led by Donald Trump in the United States of America, many of these wars that are taking place would ultimately be resolved. If you remember very keenly, and all of us must remember this, during the administration of Vladimir Putin and that of Donald Trump, there was even a suggestion by insiders in the United States of America that the Russians influenced the elections of Donald Trump. That tells you that there was some kind of rapprochement, some kind of dalliance between the administration of President Putin and the administration of President Trump, which was based on an understanding that you keep your territory, we keep our territory, and cohabit where it is necessary diplomatically, economically, and politically. In other words, as there is a beautiful African saying, that if there is a tree Let the eagle perch and let the hawk perch, and let us live in harmony. That, I think, would be the attitude that would govern a Trump administration towards Russia and vice versa. And very quickly, I think there would be a serious summit between Trump and Putin if the latter were to win the elections in the United States come November. I think that there are elements, particularly within the Brussels administration, who want to create the impression that Russia is expansionist, that Russia has an appetite for Russification of Europe. I don't see the evidence of that. I don't see the evidence of Russia wanting to Russify any part of Europe. What I hear the Russians to be saying, and they have been saying it consistently, we want to live in a neighborhood where we are under no threat. And we are saying that that neighborhood means the things that we agreed upon in 1991 or thereabouts, that don't bring your guns, don't bring your missiles next to our neighborhood. And our neighborhood means Ukraine. Our neighborhood means the Baltic states. Our neighborhood meant Belarusia. Our neighborhood meant at a certain time Poland and Hungary. And if you do that, then we will trade. In any event, the Russians are saying, we supply you with gas. It is in our best economic interest that we continue to do that. You are a market to us, we are a market to you. So those who are saying that the Russians want to expand into Europe and to Russify Europe, in my view, they are scaremongering. I'm not pretending that I know the mindset of the political leadership in Russia, but on the basis of the evidence that is available to us, I do not see that that is particularly the agenda. And if it were the agenda, quite a number of countries which are now in the European Union, who formerly belonged to what one would have described as the Russian sphere of influence, would not have joined in this regard. And therefore, I am one who is very reluctant to buy that argument that Russia has this appetite for expansion, and therefore to protect European culture, we've got to resist Russia, and that is our only salvation. Remember the old English saying, if you want to kill a dog, give it a bad name, and then you kill it. This is, I think, what they are trying to do with Russia. Give it a bad name, put the mark of Cain upon its forehead, and as the African saying goes, when hyena wants to eat one of its own, then it says it smells like a goat. That is what they are doing. Ukraine must make a decision. If it makes the decision to have a rapprochement with Russia, then Ukraine can continue to thrive. If I was asked by Ukrainians, what should we do in this tough neighborhood? I would tell the Ukrainians, don't bother joining NATO. Don't bother joining the European Union. Have a rapprochement with Russia because you have a sizable Russian population in your neighborhood. You have greater affinity with Russia, and trade with Russia, trade with Europe, remain neutral, and in your neutrality, you can then be a country that acts as a bridge between Western Europe and what used to be called Eastern Europe. That is what I would prescribe for Ukraine. But what is going to happen, and I think after the war is concluded, I suspect Ukraine, particularly under the administration of President Zelensky, is going to want to move to NATO. They are going to want to move to the European Union. And the Western Europe, led by the United States of America, in order to spite Russia, may, and I suspect are going to fast-track the admission of Ukraine into NATO. They are going to fast-track the admission of Ukraine into the European Union, contrary to the Copenhagen rules. The Copenhagen rules are very clear on the litmus test that must be satisfied by a country from moving from candidate to membership, but that may be ignored. It will now be a judgment call for Ukraine. And if they choose that path, they will always live in a situation where they are at war, Cold War with Russia, which is not good for them. I hope that the Ukrainians are going to make the right decision. I hope that there is going to be an administration in the United States of America which sees this. I hope that there is going to be an administration in Ukraine that is capable of seeing this, and I hope that there is going to be an administration in Russia that is capable of doing this. And if you can have this troika can then enter into an arrangement that will be for the benefit of everybody. Because Russia needs peace, Europe needs peace, America does not need war, Ukraine needs peace. And this to me is the dividend that is going to come out of decisions that are made after careful political assessment rather than assessment that is designed to spite Russia, this big bear which Western Europe fears and chooses to hate. When we were young and curious, we used to be told that the whole idea about nuclear armament is that it creates what is called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Because I know you have a nuclear device, and you know I have a nuclear device, then we are at peace. And I believe that there are men and women in positions of authority for the moment who know, or if they don't, must recognize that a nuclear war will spare none. And if we ever doubted the impact of nuclear, we only need to go to the small accidents that have occurred, first in Chernobyl in the 1980s, just a small accident, and how it affected goods and many people far away, including in Europe. We'll only remind ourselves of the small accident that happened in India in the 70s with just small leakage. We also will remind ourselves of the impact of the nuclear accident that took place in Fukushima in Japan after an earthquake. And that tells us that a fully fledged nuclear warfare would be Armageddon. Nobody would survive it. And if indeed we are aware of that, I don't think there is anybody who has an appetite for a fully fledged nuclear warfare. But the world has also shown us that mistakes can be made. The world has shown us that among us, there are mad men and mad women who may deliberately choose to put us on that path in the belief that some will be spared. But if they are such men and women, they had better be told now and here, when there is nuclear warfare, none of us will be spared, and those who remain will live such a pathetic life that it will be as good as if you did not leave. That is why, even as we have nuclear armaments, we have always moved and tried to ensure that we eliminate nuclear devices other than for peaceful use. Easier said than done, but necessary. I find that argument very simplistic. Simplistic in the sense that the economy not only of Kenya and the world and indeed any other country is a product of a combination of factors. And that combination of factors include many things. For example, if it is true that there is a war in different parts of the world to the extent that we are a global village, these factors contribute to a certain extent. Remember that Kenya and indeed many African countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, and quite a number of African countries were importing grain from Ukraine, were importing fertilizer from Russia, and there are also countries that import oil. So to that extent, whenever there is a war, we do bear the burden of it, because even insurance increases simply because it is much more dangerous to transport goods. So to that extent, you can say that there is an impact which is borne by different countries depending on the things that they import. It is also true that the things that you export, people may not have appetite or the ability to buy the things that you export because of a war situation. But to say that that is the only reason and the major reason is to be untruthful. The reality is that we have a combination of factors, both external and internal, which have an impact on economic realities in our country. And Ukraine is not Kenya's major trading partner. Not even Russia. These are not our major trading partners. If you look at our major trading partners, they are in our neighborhood. They are Uganda. They are Tanzania. These are our major trading partners. These are the ones that we should talk about. And the other thing that affects us is because our currencies are dollar denominated. And the other thing that puts us in the situation in which we are, of course, externally, is because of the IMF World Bank conditionalities, which are reminiscent of the structural adjustments that we had in the 1980s, where the World Bank comes here and tells us, devalue your currencies so that our exports are cheaper, our imports are more expensive. And of course, when they say that, we then have to adjust our taxes in order to pay our loans, which become more expensive. We adjust our taxes in order to finance our governments, like in the government of Kenya is one of the most expensive to run relative to our GDP, and it affects Kenya and other countries. And that is where we find ourselves at. But to say that there is a single factor which is contributing to this is not to understand the dynamics of economics, both domestically and externally. In 1961, the non-aligned movement was formed at that time by Joseph Broz Tito, Nasser of Egypt, Nkrumah of Ghana, Sukarno of Indonesia. The argument was that the world was bipolar. You had at that time the Soviet Union on the other side and the United States on this side with its allies, the Soviet Union on this side with its ally. And if you remember at that time, there were two major military pacts, the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, then Americans became dominant, but we are now seeing a world where there are emerging powers. The world is becoming much more multilateral. The United States of America is beginning to lose its hegemonic powers. Europe is beginning to lose its hegemonic powers. New powers are rising. The Russians, whether you like it or not, are beginning to have their foothold in different parts of the world, in Latin America, in Europe, and in Africa, the Chinese, the Indians. And Africans, for some reason, we remain weak. Politically, Africa is weak. Economically, Africa is weak. Diplomatically, Africa is weak. Begging the question that is being posed, should Africans take sides? Not necessarily. Africans should have what I call a moral compass. And a moral compass enables you to make a determination as to what is morally right. And what is morally right is to take sides with the side which has the truth on its side. That is what the non-aligned movement called non-aligned but positively neutral. So diplomatically, I would not fault any African nation that says, and many African nations actually have actively supported Russia in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And the argument has been simple. They have said, during the struggle for independence, the Russians were with us. They were with us when the French were against us, when the English were against us, when the Portuguese were against us, when the Dutch were against us, when the Italians were against us, when the Belgians were against us, the Russians were with us. And they even created an environment where our young civil servants went to study in Russia at the Friendship University. And they have always been with us. They don't abuse us. This is the reason why many African countries actually support Russia in this regard. And I don't fault them. I don't fault them because they have a reason. They remember that one good turn deserves another. But they are not, even as they are saying so, they are not saying that death of anybody is good. No. They are simply saying, when we look at the totality of the picture, this is the side that we sympathize with. And I think there are many times in conflicts when to pretend to be neutral is to be dishonest. And that does not mean that you don't feel pain, even when your enemy or those whom you do not support are dying or are being maimed.